to be here. What's my accent? Anyone knows? What is my accent? Where am I from? Any guesses?
There's only one country.
Okay, Israel, right. And in true Israel, I am Israeli. And in true Israeli fashion, I want to start with a direct question. So if you know Israelis, that's part of what we do often. Who is this guy? Anyone knows? I have one person. Yes, okay. This is Kevin Finster. He is an esteemed and respected security researcher, and he found a vulnerability that, according to reports, leaked personal information of DJI consumers, according to the media reports. And at the time when Kevin has done this research, DJI, in fact, had an active bug bounty. They just launched a bug bounty. And Kevin, although he has, lots of hair, as you can see, he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to wear the white hat. He wanted to report this vulnerability under this new, just launched DJI bug bounty. Now, the way this bug bounty was launched at the time, according to the reports, as you can see, was in this kind of fashion. There wasn't really a clear policy with a clear scope. It wasn't a bug bounty kind of policy as you're used to seeing, a contract with little elements. It was more of a PR announcement along these lines. So because there was some unclarity according to reports with respect to scope, Kevin contacted DJI. And he asked them, is this vulnerability in scope? And they said, according to the reports, it is in fact in scope. And you are authorized to conduct this testing. Not only that, they lacked the vulnerability. They offered him a $30,000 reward for that vulnerability. So I don't know if we have bug hunters today in the room with us, but $30,000 for a bug is pretty high. That's a pretty high bug. That's a high priority bug. And then the plot thickens. DJI also wanted, according to the media reports, Kevin to sign an agreement that he found was one-sided, one that left him legally exposed. So Kevin refused to sign this agreement, and in negotiations, as part of that process, a draft legal letter mentioning the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was exchanged, according to the reports. Now, this is an interesting example, because this is one of the first times that we heard about a potential legal question going public in a bug bounty settings. So how does this story end? Anyone knows? Anyone heard? Kevin ended up walking away from an approved $30,000 bug bounty. So refusing to sign the contract and walking away from that approved bug bounty. And I think this is a real, there are multiple versions to the story, and this is all according to reports, and I encourage you to go online and, look at all the versions to the story, including DJI response to this article. But this is in fact an interesting, story that sheds light on some of the emerging aspects that we are seeing when it comes to the legalese and the interactions of bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs with the law. So what I'm going to be sharing here with you today is a bit about that landscape. So just show of hands, anyone here is familiar with my prior work? Not at all, great, because we have a whole hour to dig into that. So again, this is mostly my prior work that I did before I joined Intel. Today I'm a director of global cybersecurity policy with Intel, and I also teach at UC Berkeley in the Master in Cybersecurity program. But I did this work before I joined Intel as part of my doctoral degree in the law at UC Berkeley Law School. And as part of that work, I really dived into a lot of contracts, hundreds of contracts, both of vulnerability disclosure programs, bug bounty platforms, and most importantly, bug bounty programs, to inquire what is going around in that landscape. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of that research with you today, and also going into some of the trends that we're seeing with respect to bug bounty legalese, and just, looking at some myths that are circling around. Why is this important? This is important because there is a conception among the information security community, among the research community, that the law matters here, that there are legal risks And we know that from empirical research. So this is one example. This is work done by CDT. Anyone here familiar with CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology? They are doing very important work, and in this research, what they did is they interviewed 20 leading information security professionals, hackers and other professionals working in this field. And they asked them specifically about the law. And 50% of them, half of those researchers, said in that research that they literally think about copyright law and the CFAA laws that I'm going to be talking about them today as they're doing their testing. So much that this is a consideration when they're thinking whether to disclose a vulnerability, and they might even change the way they test because of these laws. Moreover, we know from additional research that was done among 100 security researchers that 20% of them, so this is research looking at 100 research also from the academic setting, that 20% of them said they were threatened in one kind of way with legal action. And a broader research that was conducted in 2015 with more than 400 researchers, they found that 60% of the researchers reported that this consideration of legal risk is something they are thinking about when they are at that junction, when they need to decide whether to report to a corporation a vulnerability. So we know that this conception is emerging and is existing among the community. And there might be some gap between how the law operates and that conception, but it really matters because we want to foster that collaboration between security researchers, between hackers and companies, and even governmental entities. We want to foster that collaboration because in the end, getting the research to the right hands matters, right? And this is part of a lot of what my work was focused on. And I'm not alone in this kind of relaying. There are a lot of people that are operating in this relaying. In fact, CDT, as part of this work, they also collaborated and basically got a lot of experts in the field of security, 50 experts, to sign a letter to explain that we need to address this issue of the culture of legal risks that we have in information security, to ensure that we don't invite just the release of vulnerabilities out there, we don't invite full disclosure, and we are able to foster coordinated disclosure practices. So a lot of what you're going to see here today is basically a means, a way to foster that collaboration, to build a bridge between companies and hackers. And this is focusing specifically on bug bounties, but of course this is just one example of what we can do in the broader ecosystem. So let me start with this question, bug bounties. How many of you familiar? Heard about the concept? Okay. Of course, these are programs in which corporations, big corporations, and even other entities are inviting hackers to test the system in exchange for monetary and reputational rewards. So how many of you have seen something that looks like this? This is a bug bounty program, a website of a bug bounty. Okay. Even from those, for the few that I have here that have seen something like this, have you ever read the legal terms? Okay, great. So basically what we are seeing is this landscape of bug bounties that is operating, that all this manner of invitation to conduct testing, all this market, even if you will, of legal exchange of vulnerabilities, is operating under contracts. Okay, so this is the first kind of insight. This is an area that is mostly dictated by terms of use, contracts like EULAs, right, and user license agreements that you probably are familiar with, or other I accept terms that you click on every, your everyday kind of practice as you go through the internet. And I'm going to be looking at those contracts and giving you some of the background on how those contracts interact with computer crime laws and other aspects that we see in the bug bounty relaying. But first of all, I want to clarify that, again, I'm talking about prior research before I joined Intel. Although I am a lawyer in Israel, I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. And I'm expressing my own opinions. There you have it, of the fine print, the disclaimer, just in line with the other I accept terms that you're going to see here today. So the bug bounty phenomena is really expanding. This has been a trend. We know there is value in that if it's done right. We have seen it not only in Silicon Valley corporations like Google, Intel, Facebook, and others, but also in more traditional sectors like transportation, aviation, and even the government. The government has conducted multiple programs within the Pentagon, within the Department of Defense. I think they're into the 5th or 6th program they're doing right now, and they have expanded it to more platforms in which they actually invite people from all over the world to hunt and find vulnerabilities on what you might consider, the most sensitive systems of all. And because of the growth of this phenomena, it's important to take a look and see how are we adjusting the legal landscape to support that. Because this is, you can say, a newly emerging field in security, but it's definitely expanding very rapidly. And I'm proud to say that Intel, the company that I work for, also has a bug bounty program that is very successful. So I, first of all, would like to invite you all cybersecurity professionals here in the room to hunt on our program. But the point is that we are seeing this expansion in multiple sectors, including in the hardware and firmware sector. And this is just one success story coming out of the bug bounty realm. So there are a lot of conversations around bug bounties, but what I love to kind of stress out the most is that the manner these programs actually allow us to develop the pipeline for cybersecurity. So this is Jack Hagel. Any of you know him? No, he's a great guy. I just met him a few weeks ago. Now he studies at Stanford. But this guy, Jack, before joining Stanford, right after basically graduating from his last year in high school, got to intern with the Pentagon. That's after he participated in multiple programs of the Department of Defense, literally winning all the best challenge points out there for the Hack the Pentagon, Hack the Army, and Hack the US Air Force programs. And what I best like about Jack is not only that he's a really cool guy, and this is a really interesting story about how bug bounties are being used to foster the pipeline and get people excited about security and even hire them in very untraditional ways, if you can think about it, but also because of this sentence. So Jack tells us that part of what he likes about bug bounties is he is able to participate, get paid for his skill set in a manner that is legal, without having to hide his findings or to be worried about the legalese or the implications. And I think that is one of the major advantages of bug bounty. And that is why I want to make sure that as we are operating in this field, we also think about the legal aspects of it. And as I mentioned, a really cool story that because of that bug bounty participation, Jack got to spend 3 months before joining Stanford with the Pentagon. Okay. Now, another landscape that is really developing is the vulnerability disclosure landscape. And I want to make sure that I'm distinguishing between bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs. So the main difference between bug bounties, frameworks in which corporations are inviting external hackers to test their system in exchange for monetary rewards, and vulnerability disclosure programs, which are basically frameworks to create a channel of communication, a web page, a security ad email, a process in which you detail how you're going to address and receive vulnerabilities from external researchers that are reported to you without monetary rewards. That's a key distinction between vulnerability disclosure programs and bug bounties. Now, we're also seeing a major expansion in that lane because, believe it or not, regulators are actually pushing towards vulnerability disclosure programs. They are saying that you as a corporation, as part of your security maturity, as part of your reasonable security practices, you need to have that channel of communication in place so that when someone is finding something, they will be able to report it to you. And you need to have a process to handle that. Not only that, the FTC in 2 cases, so the main regulator for consumer protection in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, actually mentioned this aspect, the need to have a vulnerability disclosure program, or the way they put it, a process, an adequate process in place to receive vulnerabilities in 2 cases, in which, yes, along with other circumstances, they viewed the lack of such process unreasonable security measure. So basically illegal under the law. Because of this expansion of vulnerability disclosure program as well, and the fact that it's supported by so many regulators out there, we are also seeing more and more of these policies accepted as well. And of course, they have legal implications. So let's dive a little bit into the law. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the main anti-hacking federal law in the United States. Familiar? Some of you are? Okay. There are a lot of misconceptions around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and I do encourage you to learn more about it. If you're looking for a great resource, by the way, Leonard Bailey, who is one of the biggest experts out there, he's a special counsel to the DOJ Computer Crime Division, has a lot of talks from Black Hat and B-Sides Online, and he gives a really great overview of the law, including some of the things we're going to focus on today. So if you're looking, as you know, for something as an additional resource, that's one thing that is out there. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, in a nutshell, the important concept you need to there are many things to think about, but really the core of that law is like this notion of authorization. And the main language suggests that whoever intentionally accesses a computer without authorization, or in a manner which exceeds authorization, we're going to speak about that, and obtains information from a protected computer, that is defined pretty broadly to basically include any computer that is connected to the internet, because it's affecting commerce, shall be punished by this and that, etc. So this law has both criminal and civil liability. And if you look at the statistics that is provided by the Department of Justice, interestingly, there are not a lot of criminal cases that are using this provision against security researchers. There are really not a lot, maybe 2. In all of the history of the CFAA. There is, however, an additional component of civil liability, which means that private parties can use the CFAA and sue other private parties, individual, companies, employees, etc. That part of the CFAA is more litigated when it comes to this section. So what I want you to take away from here is this idea of authorization. Now, do we have any pen testers in the room? Yeah. So often in a pen test contract, what you will always have is consent to test the system. It's a key component of any pen test contract, which interacts with this provision that relates to authorization. It's this idea that I consented for your testing of my device or my computer. Now, we do have something that is called a circuit split. And by circuit split, I don't mean an actual circuit. I mean there is a conflict in which different states inside the United States, in the federal system, are interpreting the CFAA. And specifically this notion of authorization, and what does it mean to exceed authorization? And that split is a lot of the kind of core tension and debate when it comes to the CFAA. So I'm going to give a very quick overview, and I'm reminding everybody this is not legal advice. You should always seek your own counsel. So there is one key kind of interpretation that is focusing on circumvention of technical measures. This means that authorization is based upon technical measures. Okay, I put an authentication barrier on the way. I put a password wall. You need to provide a password to get in. If you have circumvented that password, you have circumvented a technical measure, a technological measure. And that circumvention could be exceeding authorized access. So that's one kind of key interpretation that is being used mostly in the Ninth Circuit, for example, in the First Circuit. Ninth Circuit, by the way, is California, among others. So all of Silicon Valley. And that is a narrow definition to the CFAA and this notion of authorization, because you have to have those technical barriers in place. Now, there is another kind of way to think about this. And according to that kind of approach, even circumvention of contract language, so violation of employment contracts, could be exceeding authorization, because I have established the boundaries of authorization via contracts. And if you violated something, for example, you use the information in a way that is not consistent with the contract, you have exceeding authorization and violated the CFAA. And that approach is mostly debated and caused a lot of case law. And if I can recommend you one case to look at is the Nozzle case, in which California looked at this approach and said, wait a minute, this is not what the CFAA was meant to address. The CFAA was about hacking. It wasn't about contract breach of employees. So this debate is still actually ongoing. It's a really interesting debate. We have one case in the DC circuit so in the Washington area, that is actually looking at the practice of algorithmic auditing. So these are people that reverse engineer algorithms from the outside, and whether scraping is a violation of the CFAA in public-facing websites. So that question of the legality of scraping under the CFAA is actually right now highly debated. In one case in DC and another case called IQ in the Ninth Circuit. So it's a really interesting area of the law, and I know you're really curious about the case law, but I do encourage you to take a look. It is an important area. Now, in addition to the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, we have another law, the Dmca. How many of you heard about the Dmca? Many hands, right. The Dmca is very famous among the security community also because of the exemption and the triennial proceedings in which the Copyright Office created a special exemption for the purpose of good faith security research. So I'm going to talk about that, but before, what's the deal with the DMCA? The DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, has in fact a provision that is prohibiting the circumvention of technological measures that effectively control the access to software as a copyright-protected work. And there are some statutory exemptions, so the law itself has exemptions for the purpose of encryption and research in that area, but they have a lot of limitations. For example, for security testing, you have some conditions that you need to follow in order to get them. But the the law also recognized that with technology development and innovation, we might need new exemptions from this anti-hacking provision that we have in the copyright law. So they created a process in which people can go to the Copyright Office, to an administrator or regulator that is operating in this field, and tell them, give us an exemption for 3 years from this anti-circumvention provision for the purpose of doing something that we, the public, need, and is not really undermining copyright protection. And one of these exemptions that started already in 2015, really because of great work of many people, was actually renewed and expanded last year. So we do have an exemption from the DMCA, from that specific law. Remember, it only deals with the DMCA. It doesn't deal with the CFAA that's still operating in the background. And that exemption enables and fosters good faith security research, but it also has some limitations. Now, one of the key limitations was the device limitation. Originally in 2015, this was actually narrowly applied to consumer voting machines and automobile, among others, and also medical devices, but that device limitation was removed. So now this exemption is applying to many other devices as well, but there are still other issues like you need to lawfully acquire the device, you need to only engage in the practice solely for the purpose of good faith security research. You still need to not violate any other law, including the CFAA. We're going to talk about that. And you need to carry you need to conduct the research in a manner and in an environment that is designed to avoid any harm to individuals or the public, which is really the key concern. That's where we are so focused about code and vulnerability disclosure, because we want to minimize that harm, that potential harm for end users. So you see there are many conditions to this exemption as well, but it's already broader, it's applicable, and it was renewed once already in 2019, so I encourage you to keep following those proceedings and where that exemption lies. But most importantly, where does bug bounty gets into that discussion? Where does bug bounty interact with that discussion? So in that kind of relationship between all these laws, the key idea is authorization. Also in the context of the DMCA, the practice that you need exemption from is a practice that you originally didn't get the authorization of the owner for. If you have those authorization, the consent of the owner, then you do not need that exemption because you have the consent to test the system. And the way those laws are interacting is essentially the bug bounty terms are where we're going to see that notion of authorization playing out. Now, when I first conducted this research, I'm talking about a year and a half ago, when I was looking through terms of bug bounty programs, this notion wasn't as developed. We haven't seen a lot of bug bounty terms actually including specifically this idea of authorization inside their program and specifically authorizing access for the purpose of this law. But since then, industry has created standards in this area to really address this tension and use the contracts of the bug bounty to address some of the legal risks in order to not be reliant solely on the Dmca exemption that, as you saw, has multiple conditions that you need to address in order to get it. So what is this notion of a bug bounty safe harbor? So safe harbor, the concept, you heard about it? Some hands? Yes, we do have some hands here. Right. So this is the idea. The idea is, in a contract, I can give you authorization. And I can, in my contract, and in this case in a bug bounty policy, include some provisions that will allow you to test and not basically feel that risk or be worried about the legal implications, because I specifically address those risks in a contract language. Now, in that landscape, you already saw some movement. So when I first did the research, again, we didn't have a lot of safe harbors out there. I looked at hundreds of policies, and in fact, although we already had some guidance for the Department of Justice in their framework, which I'm going to talk about, where they said, these legal considerations with respect to the CFA is something you need to consider when you're establishing a bug bounty. Although we had that already, adoption of safe harbor wasn't as popular. But then Dropbox was really the first company to come and adopt a safe harbor into their policy. And I'm proud to say that I had something to do with this. In fact, I encouraged them to adopt the Dmca exclusion that you're seeing right there. At the time, and again, this is my prior work, I started a movement called Legal Bug Bounty. It operated on Twitter. And I had a lot of basically specific programs that I looked at their terms, and I published some tweets around it, and I worked with many of the companies in Silicon Valley to foster more adoption of safe harbors into bug bounties. I'm going to speak a little bit about that. But what this is geared to do is basically take that contract of the bug bounty and specifically address this question of anti-hacking laws within the language of the bug bounty brief. So you would expect to see in this regard, again, a legal part of a bug bounty, not just the technical scope or definition of what is allowed and how much you're going to get for your bugs and some maybe other parts, but also a part that is addressing some of the legal concerns. And in that part, in some respects, we're now seeing more safe harbors, more of that language that specifically addresses the issue of legal risks. Now, why is this important? By the way, we do have some empirical research out there that looks at the market of bug bounties. And this is very important academic work that is done. If you're looking for a little bit, of academic work that can give you some insights about the real economics of that market, I really invite you to take a look at the work of Lazaka et al. Lazaka, Zhao, they have multiple papers in this area. In fact, they're my co-authors on future work, but I really recommend you to take a look. And one of their work looked at 77 policies from HackerOne as of January 2016. So yes, this is outdated work. I recognize that. 3 years in bug bounty industry is a lot. A lot has changed since then. But then at the time, they found that 17 from 77 analyzed policies had in fact that clause that suggests that the corporation will not take legal action if you follow the terms of the bug bounty. But they also found that having that clause from a statistical perspective didn't affect the crowd. So it didn't cause the crowd to change their behavior or to operate differently just from a statistical academic perspective. So really interesting. But again, we are talking about a partial safe harbor, just an obligation not to pursue legal action, not authorization. And also we're talking about data from January 2016. One of the interesting things to see is how is this going to change now that we have seen such a movement in this area. We also know that sometimes policies have different, they have language that really relies on the reading capabilities of the reader. So they also use this index that is called, that is reading aids, that is used widely in the academic perspective. And what they found is that the average readability score of bug bounty policies is around 40, which requires some college education. Now, it could be because there are a lot of technical terms in bug bounties, and it could be just because of how this academic index is geared to operate. But it's still very interesting because we really want to clarify that language and make sure that we are communicating in the best way possible. Okay. So what happened in this safe harbor movement? What we basically saw is more and more companies adopting this language, and I think one of the interesting things that we also saw is Tesla doing this really novel move. So again, happy to say that I did have something to do with this. In fact, Tesla gave me one of their challenge points, one of only 20 in the world, because of that interaction. And what they did in their language, that they not only gave the safe harbor and addressed the legal risk in terms of saying that they will not pursue legal action against hackers, but they also did something that is pretty novel. And they said that if you are a pre-approved researcher, so you need to sign up with their bug bounty, which is public, by the way. It's a public bug bounty, it's open to all, but for the purpose of this provision, you need to be a pre-approved researcher. If you sign up your Tesla as a bug bounty Tesla, and you have conducted testing, and something went wrong, because it could happen, they will fix it for free. If you follow the guidance of the program, and if you sign up yourself as a researcher, they will fix it for free. So they gave you waivers from the warranty limitations that they usually have in their EULAs, in the end user license agreements, for the purpose of the bug bounty. And that's one of the kind of novelties that we are seeing in this legal landscape, that is really recognizing that, especially when it comes to cars, for example, these are very expensive devices. So in order to foster that testing and that collaboration with the crowd, with the external community, they had to go and basically create this legal novelty, and I think they really deserve a huge shout out for that. Okay, so what are we doing? We know that researchers care about the communication elements when it comes to vulnerability disclosure and coordinated vulnerability disclosure. We know from research that when they were asked, a majority of them said that they would like to coordinate disclosure with the corporation. If they don't do it, it's because something went wrong in terms of their expectations. And we also know that policies, and this is very interesting, this is empirical research, again, Lasaka et al., that policies that have more content actually attract more bugs. So we know there is a lot of impact to the way a policy could be drafted in this regard. So what are we doing? How are we basically fostering this landscape, and how are we operating as an industry and as a community to make that legal landscape more solid and more innovative as the research continues and as this economy grows? So this is one key document, and what I really would like you all to appreciate in this document, that it comes actually from the Computer Crime Division at the DOJ. So this is the people that are really the experts on the CFAA and Dmca anti-hacking provisions. And in July 2017, and this is right after I started my research, I already had some research and some presentations going out there, and then the DOJ published this work that really complemented my work. What they do here is they say, when you're thinking about vulnerability disclosure programs, policies, so those channels of communications that you need to establish with the crowd to make sure that when someone finds something, they are able to communicate with you effectively, and they're able to report that, and they're able to find that, and you're handling that correctly. When you're thinking about establishing those channels, and when you're thinking about establishing a bug bounty program, which is essentially a standard form contract. It's a take it or leave it contract that you are putting on your website. Or if you're using a platform, bug bounty platforms, have you heard about that concept? That's the HackerOne and Backcrowds of the world. Absolutely. So bug bounty platforms are basically market facilitators. There are companies that are coordinating and setting up bug bounties to allow companies to interact with the crowd, and they have their own set of contracts as well at place. So when you're setting up those bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs, that framework gives you a little overview of what considerations, especially from the legal side, you should be thinking about. Now, this is not binding. This is a recommendation. This is just a list of considerations. It's only 7 pages. It's pretty short. I encourage you to think about it. I encourage you to go to your potential employer or whatnot, whoever you're working with, and tell them, have you thought about a vulnerability disclosure program? Have you thought about establishing that channel of communication? And when they're doing so, I encourage you to give them this document. It's really short, again, just 7 pages. And what we have in that document are some key considerations. For example, DOJ discussed on how you should be describing what is the authorized conduct and what is not authorized in very plain language. To ensure that you have established that communication, it's very clear you have established those expectations, and we don't have any discrepancies or conflicts or question marks to allow the hackers and basically the researchers that you're inviting to test your system to basically follow the law. Moreover, they're talking about establishing boundaries. So one key element is what's going around with how you're going to minimize your POC or proof of concept in order to ensure that you are not putting users' data at risk. How you minimize your interactions with users' data at all. So if you ever saw a bug bounty, for example, you will often see a term saying only use your own user credentials, your own data, never interact with the data of others. That is a very important element that the Department of Justice kind of clarifies and emphasizes in that document. They also talk about this approach of you have to be prepared. You have to be mature in order to do this kind of, to have in place this kind of programs. And they even talk about the legal language and the safe harbor component that I just showed you with respect to the authorization, and basically clarifying that you will not pursue legal action against researchers that are complying with the policy. Now, all of this is to say we are setting up clear expectations and boundaries. This doesn't mean that you have an approval to do whatever you want. This suggests that the document, the bug bounty contract, is a really important document you should be reading carefully, because that sets the boundaries of the authorization that we just talked about. If you remember, when we talked about the CFAA and the Dmca and the importance of authorization in the context of anti-hacking laws. In addition, this document also talks about scoping. So in a bug bounty, you will often see a technical scope, which is important, by the way. If you see a bug bounty without any scope, that should raise a question mark. Because this whole notion of scope, it's basically what am I inviting you to test? And when you are preparing that scope, you need to know what's going around in your scope in order to ensure that if you're providing a full safe harbor and authorization, you're actually in the legal position to do so, and you're not authorizing testing on other people's product. So this is this notion that you need to consider what kind of components and data you are putting in scope that might implicate third-party interests. Now, you also need to set up this, according to the Department of Justice, according to this document, you also need to set expectation when it comes to proof of concept. So what are you exactly expecting from the Crown when it comes to the type of proof of concept that they are delivering to you? Where do you want the crowd to stop? Is it an exploit? Or what is the level of kind of POC that you would like to see from them to ensure that you're protecting your users? Now, these are some of the considerations that you really need to drill on. And I mean, one of my key elements or my key messages to everyone considering bug bounties out there, especially if this is a bug bounty in which you are actively paying money for researchers and inviting them to test the system, to really think through the legalese. My prior work, again, that I've conducted 2 years ago has showed multiple programs in which there was no legal part at all. How many of you, so there, we don't have a lot of hunters there, but the hunters here might not be surprised to hear that. They probably saw in the past a bug bounty with no legal part at all. Because that was a phenomenon out there, and I'm proud to say that, you know, since then the market really matured. There is excellent work done by DOJ, and other work that I'm going to share with you here, some more research around, but it was a thing. So one of my key messages is if you're a hunter, or if you are a program manager, or if you're considering anything along the lines
make sure that you consult your lawyer, because this has legal aspects that you need to consider. Now, this question, by the way, is not just emerging here, it's also emerging in Europe. This is, in fact, a very interesting document prepared by CEPS, that's a task force that reviewed all of the European computer crime landscape in the context of vulnerability disclosure, and what they suggested is this issue of legal liability due to some of the laws there as well is a little bit murky, and we need to think as industry what we can do in that regard. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, if you're not familiar with my work, again, before I joined Intel, this is some of my prior work. I tried to get industry, to push industry to adopt more safe harbors and basically standardize that landscape of the legal language of bug bounties. Now, you all are familiar with standards. How many of you are familiar with open source licenses? Right. Or Creative Commons, which is a general license that we have in the copyright community that allows access to work basically by enabling the owner to use one contract to waive some of their rights in their creation, although the law default is something else. Those type of license are operating as a standard, and because there is one contract, there are many benefits that are associated with that. And I'm going to talk about that. But my main kind of focus area in this work was actually to work with a lot of companies, again, to foster the adoption of these terms. And one way that I did that with the help of Coin here, Brian, who is actually a CypherCon organizer, right? Or founder even, or not. Absolutely, that's amazing, is to create this legal bug bounty challenge coin reserved only for companies that at the time adopted a safe harbor. Okay. What I also did is to create this GitHub repository where I wanted to establish a language that lawyers of companies can take a look. Of course, people sought their own legal advice, but at least we had one language, one standards that people can take a look at, and was informed by the Department of Justice framework to consider when they are drafting their bug bounty policy. And I'm proud to say that GitHub recently adopted this language and created another fork of that language to kind of better situate the language as this landscape develops. And again, Dropbox also adopted this language. And the interesting thing here is that we see the crowd is taking a note. So Justin here, who is a great guy as well, he says, way to go, Dropbox, adopting this policy. I'm going to be hunting on your program because of this. Now, since I started this legal bug bounty movement and standard work, I collaborated with Background to start Disclose.io. Disclose.io is another standardization project in which all of you can take a look and check out their language. Seeks to create one language for bug bounty programs that is also addressing this legal landscape issue. It's open source, you can all use it. The interesting thing that Background also did is incorporate Disclose.io into their filtering system. So as a hunter, if you're a professional hunter and you want to take a look at programs that have language that includes safe harbor, you can actually filter in their platform for programs that have a safe harbor. I think that's one of the recommendations that I originally did in my prior work and in my law review paper, and they adopted it, and I think it's a great system and a great tool. And again, this standardization is key because then we have one language and we have one standard, and this really serves as a benchmark and reduces the information burden on the researchers or on the crowd and raises awareness towards this issue. And it also reduces transactional costs, drafting costs, right? Because you need to consult a lawyer, but at least we have something, one language that we can all try to think to agree on. Now, this type of work will actually be key as we see the expansion of bug bounties into new areas and new arenas. For example, Facebook's newly data abuse program that is focusing on using the bug bounty not to uncover security flaws, but to uncover privacy violations. In fact, I can also share with you guys that I'm a proud recipient of a $10,000 bug, not me alone, me and my co-authors from UC Berkeley, on a privacy-enhancing type of academic work. So as we are moving this bug bounty concept to new areas and new arenas, it will be important to also look at the legalese. So finally, and I'm about to finish up, I just want to put here on the screen some research, some basically websites and some data points you can all seek and look for if you're looking for more information from the DOJ framework. I also did a podcast with Daniel Bailey, again, a great expert on the CFAA from the Department of Justice, where we only focused on issues of deep bug bounty kind of legalese, including the interaction with extortion. There is a recent CFAA indictment that involved Linda, a subsidiary of LinkedIn, that in fact involved a bug bounty and someone coming through a bug bounty with an extortionate CFAA demand. It's a very interesting indictment. It's the first one that I'm aware of that has an interaction with the CFAA. So that's another thing to take a look at. And if you want to hear more about it, I think we discussed it a little bit at the podcast. I also put you here the links for that. Encourage you to take a look at our standardization work, Disclose.io and Legal Bug Bounty. And if you want to see my prior work on this area, you can check out this paper, Private Ordering Shaping Cybersecurity. I'm proud to say that I did negotiate that take it or leave it contract with the publisher, so that paper is going to be free, although it's part of a book, and is accessible to all on SSRM. And with that, I'm going to finish up this presentation. Thank you so much. And I hope you look for more information in this area. You can always keep the conversation going with me. Here's my handle, Amit Elazari. Really appreciate you coming here today.